I actually just finished reading a book by Robert Caro on Robert Moses. And in a lot of ways, it almost feels like the conversation you're having now is reminiscent of the fundamental debate between, do we have an automotive driven city, or do we maintain the streetscapes that really create that urban vibrancy that makes cities cities? And it sounds like what you're saying is this is another restart period, right? It's another moment in time where it sounds like the private sector and real estate developers and real estate owners, but also public officials, can recontemplate and reimagine what cities can be. And I agree, and I think that's totally the case. I'm curious, just looking retrospectively, what do you think we got wrong, pre-COVID? I'm curious, like from a planning perspective and from a real estate development perspective, what do you think we got wrong? And I'm talking about kind of the period from, say, 1990 to 2020. And because I think everyone knows what we got wrong in kind of the Robert Moses era, right? But what did we miss in that era that we should have seen?
Well, I think we relied way too much on the automobile
in
our city. And you could see major streets that were changed over time to accommodate more and more lanes of traffic, and then crowded the public realm. The sidewalk areas became less and less inclusive. So I think that, major cities around the world, look, think about it this way. For the first time in human history, more people live in cities than not. More than 50% of people live in cities. By 2050, 75% of the global population will live in cities. 80% of the world's GDP is in cities, which is pretty incredible. And yet cities are only 2% of the land area in the world, 2%. And they have over 70% of the CO2 emitted in the world. So that's why I keep on focusing on cities. And, it's just so apparent to me that what's happened, to your point, from 1990 to 2020 is the car has become so ubiquitous and so important to getting around. Even in cities that don't have mass transportation, like the city of LA, where I live, they're just trying to put transportation in now. But even in New York, with the advent of Uber and Lyft and that type of transportation, what's happened is it's actually clogged our city streets even more. And there's more and more cars circulating on the city streets, therefore taking away the public realm for people. And I really do believe this is a time when we can make that massive change happen.
Yeah.
And, translating to the future, if I can, because I've been doing a lot of talking about this, is around the advent of the driverless car. And, we're working with a lot of the car companies right now and technology companies. They're still working on the innovation, but from what I'm hearing, it's going to be here within the next, say, 15 years. So within 15 years, we have the ability to really transform our city streets, because there won't be any parking or very little parking. Cars will be pulsed in our city streets from central locations, and we won't need parking. Just think about all that opportunity for all those parked cars that sit idle all the time and taking that space for the public realm. Or 25,000 gas stations that exist in the United States, and what we can do with that land area in our cities. So we will have to design our cities of the future for major pickup and drop-off areas of driverless electric cars. But we won't have to deal with the CO2 pollution. We won't have to deal with the traffic and congestion. This is what the experts are saying, and it's going to change the face of our cities and real estate moving forward. So here we have COVID that's already starting this massive change, and then moving to, call it 10, 15 years from now, we're already having driverless deliveries already, and that's what Amazon's planning for. And then in 10, 15 years, we're going to have driverless cars upon us, and we'll be able to really replan our cities. Since the early 1900s, when the Model T was created, our cities in the early 1900s were about people. They were push carts and public spaces and amenity space, and we get to take that area back to create vibrant, walkable cities again.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about the autonomous vehicles, in part because, I think about the automobile, and even referencing back to what we just talked about in Robert Moses and kind of the vision of the automobile-driven city, the automotive city. But it did stay with us, right? It did persist in public planning that we wanted cars. We believed in car ownership. And I'm curious to get your view on this. When we do have truly autonomous vehicles, does the nature of ownership of transportation fundamentally change? And what I mean by that is, like, we think of today having a car as owning your transportation, right? So you own that. It almost feels like with Uber, and to some extent with on-demand, we're getting this proof point, this kind of canary in the coal mine of what not owning transportation with transportation as a service looks like. And you reference that so many cars sit idle during the day, right? And that creates enormous amount of environmental waste, enormous amount of space waste. But if instead we think of cars as being just a utility, right? Whether they're cars, autonomous cars, micromobility, whether transportation becomes just a utility, what does that mean for space planning in a city? And the last thing I'll say is I was reading an article on this, and someone said the notion of owning a car in 2050 will be about as awkward for someone to think about as owning an elevator. Like, you don't think about an elevator as being personal property. It just conveys you, right, spatially to where you're going. And yet we've been conditioned to think of transportation as something we own. And sorry, last related point to this question, I know it's a long one, is America in particular has mythologized car ownership in a way. I mean, you can look at any newsstand and you see just car and driver and all the obsession with cars and ownership of cars. And I'm wondering how in America, if transportation moves to a utility, will we want to give up our right to own cars, right? Will that become a source of identity for many Americans in the future?
At first, I think it has to do with age. People my age are used to owning and using a car as part of your life. It's part of for some people, it's part of their identity. But take my children. Both my kids are obviously working and don't own cars, and they don't. And I believe the millennials of the world right now, they take Uber and Lyft, they ride their bike, or they take scooters, but they don't own cars. And so I think it's more of an age thing. And the amount of cars that are being bought right now are mostly being bought by older Americans than younger Americans. So I think it's already shifting already. And I think that I really do think in the future that it will be ubiquitous. It'll be like you mentioned in your quote, that people will not have to depend on the car for anything. That it'd be ubiquitous as getting to your point and getting in an elevator and being able to use just-in-time transportation, which obviously cars will be able to drive much closer together within 3 feet apart from one another, and be able to pick you up from and to your destination directly, which I think from an efficiency standpoint is going to be just so much better. And look, there'll still be, people ask me this question all the time, there'll still be car enthusiasts that own their own car. Or someone might own one car, and a family might own one car instead of two. One car, and by the way, 60% of all trips are less than 6 miles. So think about that. There's a lot of trips that are shorter trips. And that's why you saw over the last couple of years before COVID, the advent of scooters, because the last mile, that dealt with the last mile. People wanted to travel, in their cities or in their neighborhoods for a mile or less, or from the train station to their job. And so I do believe that, and that's a really important statistic, because if you think about it, if all those trips are local trips, it's going to totally change in the future when we have driverless cars about how our cities are utilized. So I think for the car enthusiast, you'll still have a car moving forward, maybe one instead of 2 or 3. And then it'll slowly traverse away where you just won't need a car at all, and you'll have local transportation.
It's interesting to hear you talk about micromobility, because in some ways it also seems like a canary in the coal mine for how transportation changes. Because, when we were looking at the space and we looked at the previous companies that had tried to quote, disrupt walking, right? The initial version of that was Segway, right? Everyone remembers Segways. Sometimes you still see tours that are happening on Segways and policemen at the airport on Segways. But it almost feels like what that concept, that form factor got wrong was ownership. That what was different about the wave of micromobility that is kind of taken the world by storm in the last 2 years is that they didn't change anything. In fact, most of the scooters that are on the streets today in Paris and Los Angeles and San Francisco are actually worse form factors and worse models than the Segways. What they were, though, is ubiquitous and unowned, right? They were a utility service. They were on demand. They had this flexibility and ownership. And so it's interesting because it almost forces you to contemplate, going back to your concept of like the 20-minute city, which is what's the value of walking, right? And how do you disrupt walking? And to the extent you have these different modalities, autonomous vehicles for kind of intermediate trips and micromobility for much shorter term trips, and then your own 2 feet. If you're going at a very short distance, how does that change and condition what we demand and what cities look like in terms of what's nested together between commercial districts and residential districts and retail districts? And I guess to put that into a question, it's that do you think that as transportation becomes more ubiquitous, as things can come to you, this axiom that has defined real estate for so long, which is location, 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 right? That's what you hear whenever you go into the real estate industry. That location starts to become more amorphous, more nebulous, more flexible, more fungible in terms of the things come to you. And people then are making more deliberate choices about where to live because they have on-demand delivery, they have same-day delivery, they can get anything they want via this ubiquitous transportation network. How do you think that changes the appearance of cities if you were to look at it from like a 30,000 foot level?
Sure. I would say as long as the neighborhood, the community, the city is all about live, work, play, that it's mixed use, that it's walkable, that it's vibrant. If that takes place, then we can have more ubiquitous cities and communities that are connected together. But again, it comes back to that 20-minute zone. And COVID's proved this out, by the way. If you look at it, people are only walking or commuting within, say, a 15-minute commute of their home right now. And that's the key, I think, of the future is these walkable, vibrant cities. Live, work, play, where you can work and live and play in the same general area. It's the future. And I do believe that that's why you're seeing much more micro mobility that we've been discussing. And by the way, we haven't mentioned bicycling, and bicycling is, the utilization of bicycles is way over the top recently because people, again, want to live within that 15, 20-minute, live, work, and play within that 20-minute zone. But then connecting to hubs, obviously mass transportation that already exists, combined with the autonomous vehicles of the future. And remember, we're hoping that in the future, we're thinking in the future, these won't be hour-and-a-half commutes anymore. A city like Los Angeles over the last year, it could take an hour to get anywhere that would only take 15 minutes 10 years ago. So we believe that it's going to really help with traffic also, which has been, if you ask people what the major issues of cities are, it's traffic, obviously, is a major, major issue of our cities moving forward.
And it sounds like what you're describing is, to some extent, what I think of Los Angeles as being today, which is this kind of constellation of micro that are all kind of amalgamated and intermeshed with one another, and they become a city unto itself. Becomes a solar system, right? Of these different hubs,
exactly.
Nodes,
constellation of cities, exactly.
And
exactly.
Kind of transitioning that a bit to more of I guess, a social and economic question. How do you think that impacts, one of the very important issues we're struggling with in the U.S., especially today, of inequality, right? And how kind of segmenting different populations by wealth or by profession, by working class, or by kind of the affordability of housing. Do you think that leads to a more inclusive city, or do you think that further leads to segmentation of our cities between the affluent areas and these kind of more challenged parts of the city that really struggle to get city services?
Well, everything we've just been talking about is about accessibility and
Right.
having access to transportation, accessibility and mobility. So the cities of the future are all going to be, and the major issue you're talking about societally is about affordability, and certainly our cities are dealing with that right now, and accessibility. Look at the major cities in the United States, and affordability is a huge issue right now. You know, the separation between the rich and the poor and what's taking place, and demographics that are taking place in our cities. So I've had the opportunity of presenting to many cities about this, and the goal of creating much more housing, affordable housing, a stock within our cities is so important. And I got to give cities a lot of credit. There's many new codes and zoning codes coming into play that give density bonuses for creating more affordable housing. They'll allow you to build more, developers to build more, if you provide affordable housing within that area. Remember, I want to come back to the third element, which is the public realm, and creating those great, diverse public spaces where everyone has equal access to parks and amenities and streets and dining and so forth. And then combine that with which we were just talking about, accessibility. Accessibility, affordability, public realm. Accessibility being so important. Accessibility to jobs, accessibility to education, accessibility to affordable housing. Just can't emphasize that enough.
And I'm curious because it sounds like there's so much incumbent on cities to do, right? To utilize this opportunity to right themselves, right? To kind of repair some of the urban design wrongs of the past. And I'm curious to contextualize that in the context of where we are today, which is, today, at least our company is working remotely. And knowledge workers, it seems like, just based on my network, are thinking much more broadly about where to live. They're still thinking about cities, but the notion that I have to be in New York to work in finance, or I have to be in San Francisco to work in technology, those assumptions are being questioned. And do you think we end up in an environment in the US in particular where cities are in competition for knowledge workers, meaning the cities that create that robust live, work, 20-minute city environment are attracting knowledge workers? And the way I think about it is it's a bit like the kind of direct-to-consumer model for enterprise software, which is cities, of course, are trying to generate tax revenues. And what they know is that if you attract enough tech workers to a particular city, that corporation for which they work will probably have to open an office there. So it's a bit like how Slack, right, sells its product into companies. They get users to use it directly, right, without a corporate subscription. And then once enough users are using it, they go to the company and they say, hey, you should have a corporate subscription. Do you think that a city like Boise will say, let's attract Google workers in, building a very livable, very dynamic city, a 20-minute city that is very attractive for families and for young professionals? And in doing so, they'll get the concentration of Google workers, where Google will almost be forced to say, we have to open an office in Boise. Do you think that we end up in that kind of environment where cities are almost in competition directly with one another for the knowledge workers that are kind of forebearers of tax revenues?
Well, look at what the competition that was, a year ago around Amazon and where they locate.
Right.
And by the way, one of the other key components was education, higher education close by.
Right.
Or you look at the migration of companies from, say, California to Texas and what they're looking for. And again, we talked about the 20-minute city and walkable, vibrant cities. We're talking about education and access to younger workers, young tech workers, and the ability to let them thrive in these cities. But also, I would say there's two parts to this argument. There's one of the suburban-like cities or smaller cities, but then there's the vibrancy of a New York or a San Francisco, where, take Google or take Google as an example. They were still looking to create their own environment within a city. So to create a campus within a campus. Salesforce did it in San Francisco. A campus within a campus, where you can use the public amenities of that city and not be a closed campus, but you're part of that city and you have access to all these knowledge and tech workers that live there. So I think there were two models that were going on. One of more the suburban model, big campus model. You mentioned Boise. There's many campuses, say in Austin, Texas, that are like that. Self-sufficient campuses. And then it was moving towards more of an urban campus where you're integrated within the social fabric of a city using the amenities of that city. And canvassing the younger people, they wanted to be in that environment. They wanted that vibrant, walkable environment. So I think it's both. I think it could be happening both ways.